Good, no problem. So, hello everyone, I am Darren McGarvey. Thanks for coming along. This is a pretty decent turnout for a Wednesday afternoon. I'll just quickly give a short preface to contextualise today's lecture. I am close to completion of my third book, Trauma Industrial Complex, Trauma and Oversharing in an Age of Lived Experience, which is a book which attempts to examine the phenomenon of lived experience in the context of online trauma discourse and attempts to perform a number of functions simultaneously. The first one being to chart the rise of trauma discourse, to see its journey as a purely clinical term to a kind of colloquial mainstay, which has become common parlance in all of our daily conversations. Also, the rise of lived experience culture, where people disclose intimate details of their lives, often as an attempt to help people, to support people, or sometimes to authenticate third parties, organisations, media, charities, and whatnot. Yeah. No problem. Okay, we are live. Is that it? Is that it? Just universities, eh? What they like. And also the book, in a kind of contradictory, somewhat ironic way, but in a very deliberate way, attempts to caution people with lived experience of trauma who are moving around in the civic sphere, disclosing details of their lives, against doing that until they're ready, because often the wounds that we carry from our trauma are what draw us into those spaces, seeking validation, wanting our pain to be seen. And often the facilitators of our lived experiences don't possess the experience themselves of having disclosed their details, or don't possess the necessary insight into how trauma shows up in our daily lives in order to provide the adequate duty of care. So the book introduces various concepts throughout across 14 chapters. What I'm going to read to you today is the chapter that I've just finished, which is the penultimate chapter of the book before the conclusions, and it's called The Politics of Trauma. And at various points, if a term or a concept which I've introduced earlier in the book comes out of nowhere, I might take a few seconds just to contextualise it and clarify it. I'll try not to break the flow. Let me just get to the start. This is me just pushing through the manuscript.
He said he welcomes any feedback.
Okay, only a year over my deadline this time. Trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Yes.
This much we understand.
Yes, because we're full.
It unfolds within the fabric of relationships that were once a relative source of security, belonging, and support. At its heart, trauma is a violation of trust in these connections. When that stability is shattered, whether by betrayal, abuse, neglect, or calamity, the wounds cut deep. These relationships extend beyond personal connections and include our attachments to communities, employers, institutions that shape and govern our existence. Even our relationship with the natural world relies on a fundamental trust that every storm will eventually pass, that the ground beneath our feet won't give way. Consider survivors of natural disasters or catastrophic accidents. Think about victims of abuse betrayed by the very criminal justice system meant to protect them, or a child excluded from school, the only safe place in their life for challenging behaviour. Though these scenarios seem disparate, they share a common thread. The wounds inflicted are deepened by the shattering of faith in a safe and stable reality. When you step onto a train, you trust the brakes will work. When you board a plane, you assume its navigation systems are sound. When you lay a towel on a sunny beach, you do so believing there's no tsunami racing towards you unseen. Trauma is the moment that trust is obliterated, when you realise you're not okay, and that realisation is so sudden and overwhelming, it exceeds your capacity to cope. In many cases, trauma doesn't arise from the initial event, but it's aggravated by the systems we've created, systems ill-equipped to handle trauma's effects. These structures, far from offering support or healing, often deepen the wounds. Take, for example, the children present during a dawn raid on a suspected drug dealer's home. Police officers don't pause to consider the impact of their violent entrance, shouting, smashing doors, brandishing weapons, on the young minds witnessing the chaos. The children aren't suspects, but they are still collateral damage. Consider the way social security interacts with long-term benefit claimants or those with physical or mental disabilities. Communications from these agencies are often cold, bureaucratic and impersonal, designed to elicit compliance rather than understanding. For vulnerable individuals, these interactions feel less like assistance and more like psychological waterboarding, a barrage of letters, forms and demands that provoke panic and dread. Even healthcare systems, which should be sanctuaries of compassion, can unintentionally exacerbate trauma. Children undergoing radiation therapy for cancer are routinely separated from their parents, left to face the frightening experience alone. Mothers struggling with drug addiction, often a symptom of unaddressed trauma, are imprisoned for petty crimes, further fracturing families. And young offenders, many themselves victims of abuse and neglect, are locked in cells for 23 hours a day, isolated in facilities teeming with other violent offenders. These practices don't just fail to address the root causes of their behaviour, they compound the trauma that arguably drove it in the first place. Trauma and social inequalities are deeply intertwined, a relationship long recognised in trauma theory and advocacy. Judith Herman, a pioneering figure in the study of trauma, notes in Trauma and Recovery, the conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. This duality not only underscores the personal struggles of survivors, but also the broader societal forces that perpetuate cycles of harm. Herman further emphasises that recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. Healing trauma, therefore, requires not only personal effort, but also the dismantling of systemic inequities. Efforts such as reducing economic disparities, expanding access to education, and implementing wider support services are crucial in creating environments where survivors can genuinely thrive. These impassioned calls for structural change reflect a belief in the interconnected nature of individual and collective healing. In her advocacy for equality, theorist Bell Hooks wrote about the transformative power of love, observing that love is profoundly political. This revolution will come when we understand this truth. Hooks' insight provides a framework for approaching trauma advocacy with compassion and radical care. It suggests that creating a fairer society is not simply an adjunct to healing, but a fundamental part of it. Trauma work, when approached in this way, becomes not just an act of individual survival, but also a call to reshape society. The journey of recovery, both personal and societal, must be rooted in recognition of the systems that create and sustain trauma. Only then, argue many advocates, can we hope to create a world where healing is not a privilege, but a right accessible to all. This is where I part ways with many on the left flank of trauma discourse. In theory, I'm on board. In practice, I'm unsure how you can legislate a right to freedom from trauma. And I believe there are risks, wherever it is implied, that healing and political activism go hand in hand. Any right to any freedom may be granted, but can never be perpetually guaranteed when extended to the individual by an external force. We haven't even cracked the conundrum of ensuring everyone on the planet has access to clean water, which raises doubt as to the workability of a right to freedom from trauma. In his book, Freedom from Want, The Human Right to Adequate Food, George Kent explores the complicated business of human rights in exhaustive depth through the lens of sustenance. Kent first defines two specific groups: right holders, to those whom the right to adequate food is extended, and duty bearers, those charged with seeing that this right is fulfilled. Kent argues that while we may rhetorically extend the right to adequate food to all people, as Roosevelt did in his Four Freedoms Address, or even legally, as the United Nations and numerous national and international bodies have done since, such a seemingly basic right can be wickedly difficult to implement in practice. It requires allocating resources, determining logistics, and following chains of accountability. That's always the hardest thing. And then there are also the various potential interpretations of the right itself. Is freedom from trauma or the right to healing achieved by simply providing for those in need? Or is true and complete freedom achieved when citizens possess the means by which to provide that for themselves? Who is ultimately responsible for creating the conditions for this empowerment to occur? Perhaps my own experience of breaking free from the chains of addiction may shed further light on my perspective. In January 2013, at the end of a 7-day drinking spree, about to open another bottle that would tide me over until the off-licence opened, a woman whom I've never met sent me a message on social media. It was a link to an article that would snap me out of my drunken daydream. 6 harsh truths that will make you a better person. I figured it would pass some time and began reading. By the time I got to number 1 on the list, everything inside you will fight improvement. The urge to continue drinking quite simply left me. What had occurred was the profound psychic shift only a high targeted dose of truth can bring about. For years, I had dined out on my trauma, my losses, my grief, and my anger, using them as excuses of varying plausibility to justify my descent into alcoholism. It's true that I faced significant adversities in my youth. They had a lasting impact on my character and emotional nature, for better or worse. But at some point, I lost touch with the idea that a better life was even available to me. I became resigned to the misery of depression, the painful solitude of self-isolation, and the invigorating, if toxic, effects of my righteous anger. I was sick because the world was sick, and I couldn't get better until the world improved. My solution was to try and make the world better from within the confines of my sick mind. But oddly, nothing ever seemed to work. The article read like a mug of cold water thrown in my face. My blunted faculties sharpened, and self-awareness pierced the thick fog of denial. And after I finished the piece, I poured what remained of my alcohol down the kitchen sink and told my long-suffering flatmate I was done with the drinking. From that day, my recovery began in earnest, and I wouldn't lift a drink for a further 2 years. Save for a few slips along the way, I have been alcohol and drug-free for most of the last 10 years. How was this achieved? Where did the power to stop drinking come from? A power that had eluded me almost every day of my 20s. Did it come from the state? Was it supplied by the market? I got sober in run-down community centres and churches where no experts or professionals were present. Indeed, my many interactions with public services throughout the years played some part in my adopting the false belief that I would never get free of the addiction. Instead, I got well in rooms where the advice dispensed came from other sufferers of the problem, not from medical professionals or theorists. Mutual aid groups where there are no hierarchies, no professional titles, and no state or private funding. I learned to traverse the greatest challenge I have ever faced as an individual, the illness of addiction, merely by following the suggestions of those who'd gone before me. I did this in a community where it is understood that we could only ever hope to be of any meaningful or lasting use to our community by first making ourselves accountable. Accountable for whatever part we play in our adverse circumstances. Accountable for the harms we've caused, for our dishonesties, our attitudes and our behaviours, and committing to living by certain principles. In those rooms, we achieve freedom from the want for easy solutions, freedom from the want for something to numb the pain and confusion of life. And we achieve this freedom by learning to reconcile our individual needs and desires with the world, not as we'd like it to be or need it to be, but as it is. We reclaim our right to liberty from addiction by taking that freedom ourselves. I am well aware there are those whose challenges are too profound to assure medical expertise, whose economic adversity is too acute to simply think your way out of. But in my experience, these are lessons as to how anyone within reason might still better orient themselves in the face of a personal problem rooted in systemic inequality, so as to lighten the individual burden and make themselves more useful in the wider struggle. It's in this space that the two distinct ideological tracks of what I call the trauma industrial complex, advocates who believe systemic change is the answer, and individualists who promote the ideology of self-help, must be viewed. The ideological tug-of-war at the heart of trauma discourse is merely an echo of a much deeper struggle between competing visions of the Western world. It's also a struggle that has in many ways defined my own politics. Two powerful stories, seemingly impossible to square off, spooling endlessly alongside one another. On one side, the ideology of individualism, with its emphasis on personal responsibility, self-reliance and achievement, has profoundly shaped how we talk about trauma. This framework often detaches trauma from the social conditions in which it arises. Trauma in this context becomes primarily a personal struggle, a wound to be healed through introspection, therapy or self-help. Recovery becomes an internal project, requiring resilience and effort on the part of the individual, with little attention paid to the broader systemic forces that created the harm in the first place. Survivors are encouraged to focus on their own healing, as though their suffering exists in a vacuum, unconnected to structural inequalities. This decontextualisation of trauma has profound implications. When trauma is reduced to a personal problem, it risks pathologising the individual while ignoring the systems that perpetuate harm. This approach does not just fail to confront the root causes of trauma, but subtly implies that survivors are responsible for overcoming it on their own, something a lot of the science points to as being actually impossible. The individualisation is further entrenched by the commodification of healing. The burgeoning wellness and self-help industries have turned trauma recovery into a lucrative market, offering courses, apps, retreats and other individualised solutions that, while sometimes helpful, really challenge the societal systems that produce trauma on such a scale. By centering recovery on personal transformation, these industries perpetuate the notion that healing is a private affair. For trauma to be genuinely addressed, it must be understood as both a personal and a societal issue, one that demands not only individual healing, but also a commitment to reforming the systems that perpetuate harm. On the left, where most trauma advocates fighting for system change reside, these individualist delusions and refrains are robustly challenged. The ludicrous notion that one person, by sheer force of will, can offset multiple deprivations merely by changing their attitude or by working harder, rightly invites rebuke. In recent years, trauma advocacy has increasingly intersected with political movements, transforming the work of healing into a dual mission: personal recovery and societal change. Healing is no longer seen solely as an individual endeavour, but as a collective responsibility to foster a more compassionate and equitable world. Those of a more socialist disposition, who believe the plight of the poor is best served through collective action and the state, are, in my view, correct in their analysis. But this perspective almost always lacks any analysis of the role that the individual may still play in producing better circumstances, even within that unjust context. Furthermore, on the left, it can be offensive to suggest that not all individual problems are rooted in failing systems, that some of our problems may be of our own making, or may be ours alone to solve, including healing from trauma. I have been accused of engaging in what is tantamount to victim blaming, for pointing out the various ways an individual who lacks insight, self-awareness, or like me, becomes gripped by the malady of addiction can make their experience of a problem rooted in inequality, like trauma, much harder than it has to be. And I've been criticised for asserting that in many cases, before a person can begin to consider acting meaningfully upon an unjust society, they must become willing to change themselves, the most radical thing some people will ever do. But even in the event of our hypothetical utopia becoming a reality, where a service rises to meet every need and every resource is made available to tend to every ailment, all the experts and money and time in the world will not prevent an alcoholic from drinking until they decide to stop. This is evidence of agency at the level of the individual. Agency which, when channeled correctly, may have as transformative an effect on a person's circumstances as entourages of wraparound professional support. The need for change is undeniable. The question therefore arises, should we grant the popular notion that the wounded themselves must rise up and reorder the world around them through political action? What does this look like in practice? As we've explored in great depth so far in the book, not in this lecture, Too often, those carrying unhealed wounds are thrust into the forefront of this crusade. Lived experience storytellers are burdened with the emotional labour of sharing their narratives only for the stories to be appropriated by facilitators, facilitators being media, researchers, anybody who is a third party in the transaction of someone disclosing details of their lives. These narratives, used to raise awareness and push for reform, are deployed in two distinct ways. Either to drive radical, often urgent campaigns that call for swift political action, or to support more moderate, pragmatic advocacy, pushing for incremental reform. Let's briefly explore these two distinct and competing campaign styles to gain a clearer understanding of the complexities and dynamics beneath the rhetoric. First, consider the role of radicals. Radical campaigns call for profound changes that challenge existing systems and power structures. They use lived experience stories to emphasise the urgency of reform, often sparking controversy or public outcry. Consider calls to defund the police in the United States, or proposals for juryless trials in Scotland as a remedy to low conviction rates for male rapists. There is usually an urgent need for action at the heart of such campaigning, but arguably an over-optimistic assessment of both the political terrain and indeed the longer-term implications of such policy and practice. Radical campaigns draw media attention, creating lively, often toxic, public debates. But in the end, by their very nature, these campaigns often come to nothing. When campaigns fail or come up against criticism, there is really any examination of strategy or tactics. Failures are integrated into the mythology of the wider struggle against power. Questions or critiques are rarely regarded as opportunities to refine or clarify. Instead, they are labelled as attempts to invalidate, dismiss, or minimise lived experiences and identities. The belief is cultivated that the in-group is under siege, which creates the bunker mentality many come to associate with radical online activism. If truly radical proposals do gain wider traction and support, it's a certainty that they will only ever be considered for policy after lengthy deliberation, compromise and concession. More experienced radicals understand that hard positions adopted strategically ahead of a potential negotiation must soften when the prospect of a deal arises. They use their influential place within communities to prepare the ground for such an eventuality. Less experienced radicals, however, are famed for towing their radical red lines, even if doing so guarantees defeat. Such a radical, confined by the strictures of their political identity, no matter the real-world implications for whichever group they claim to be advocating on behalf of, is likelier to cut their nose off to spite their face and kick back at the notion of compromise. Their activism carries a specific emotional signature, an unrepentant vulnerability contradicted by a confrontational certainty. To be seen cutting deals with opposition they often portray as evil or malign is to risk being cut adrift by the tribe, an identity rupture too severe to bear. This ideological fixity is pathological, but rather than a mark of true conviction, it is often the result of political inexperience or misplaced loyalty. In this context, lived experiences in politics become one and the same. The personal is the political and no border between the two exists. Sorry, 2 seconds. But often, the most passionate campaigners are themselves victims of abuse or neglect. This is both a blessing and a curse. They possess the proximity of experience to the issue to offer deep insight, but due to a lack of inner work, they are notoriously prickly characters to deal with. Some of the most effective political activists operating today, unflinching in their critiques of unjust systems and unrelenting in their pursuit of change, I suspect, are also some of the most unhappy, dysfunctional and wounded people in the political sphere. Their wounds drive them to amazing feats of political exertion, and when they often win big and make a material difference in the lives of the most vulnerable. I'm in constant awe of their dedication and tenacity and their appetite for discomforting the powerful. For many, however, though certainly not all, the political fight, impossible and futile as it often is is a well-beaten and familiar path, far easier for them to tread than the overgrown, poorly lit road of self-examination and healing. For them, the notion of introspection is a distraction or indulgence, a sign of low character. This story they tell themselves itself a form of avoidance, where campaigning becomes the means by which deeper truths are pushed down and locked away. Pragmatists, on the other hand, present altogether differently. Possessed of a cooler temperament, many radicals believe this signals a lack of seriousness, urgency, or investment. Pragmatists regard reform as a marathon, not a sprint. They take an entirely different approach from radicals, attempting to avoid the white-hot light of public scrutiny by operating within the civic sphere. This arena naturally draws little public interest due to the opaque bureaucratic perimeter that surrounds it. The public is occasionally granted a glimpse behind the wall through carefully crafted press releases, publicity stunts, or public events, but business is largely conducted behind the scenes between advocacy groups and decision makers. A sprinkle of lived experience aids the optics. Connections are forged over time, and campaigns often spanning years or even decades. Is any of this sounding familiar? Anyone in here? Good, I'm glad. Pragmatists accept the unjust status quo, presenting narratives in an apolitical, decontextualised manner and pushing for reforms that often lack political teeth. However, this dynamic is complicated by the fact that many pragmatists have operated within the very systems they seek to reform. Former police officers fight for violence reduction and drug reform. Former third sector executives lead reviews meant to hold the third sector accountable. The former politicians turned campaigners critique democratic institutions. Pragmatists have no real strategy to hold decision makers accountable in the way radicals do when promises are watered down or fail to materialise. Furthermore, social and professional networks often bring advocates into close contact with decision makers. Advocacy groups and campaigners in the civic sphere frequently depend on decision makers in various ways, whether for funding or prominent positions within discourse. These dependencies often perpetuate suffering, resulting in unspoken compromises or blind eyes turned, all of which passes for grown-up politics. I'm going to have a lot of friends after this book, I can tell. It's the promise of greater proximity to power that moderates the pragmatists' approach. They tell themselves a story about their pragmatism to ward off the sense they are participating in a political charade. Politics dictates the terms of engagement, not moral urgency or even common sense. Pragmatists advocating for change deemed too radical or politically problematic risk funding cuts or losing their voice at influential tables. The main strategy, therefore, and this is really important, and don't forget this, is to make it politically safe for decision makers to throw their weight behind certain causes by not asking too much of them. This partly explains why political leaders so enthusiastically endorse trauma-informed approaches in schools, prisons and mental health services, and why the lexicon of trauma has been culturally fast-tracked in civic spaces. This provides the mirage that change is occurring, while the resources required to implement genuine trauma-informed principles are withheld. Both the radical and pragmatic approaches are valid. Both have their merits, their wins and losses to count, but in both cases, lived experience is enlisted to advance third-party political objectives. People sharing their lived experiences are often motivated by the false hope that their stories will lead to change, when in truth this rarely happens. Still, we must not completely abandon hope, and there are those of us who busy ourselves by joining the fight via some other means. For most, social media is the weapon of choice. But due to great confusion about the true nature of our problem, trauma, many of us living with it dive headlong into the battle, believing this is where the healing is done. There is an order of business, however, where trauma and politics align. And it's clear that when faced with the options to fight, flight or fawn, many of us are choosing to fight irrespective of our fitness for combat. You need only observe the state of public discourse on almost any political topic to see the role unprocessed trauma plays in escalating conflicts between various communities, trapped in ascribed identities and distorted victim mentalities. These are terms I defined earlier in the book, but for reasons of brevity, I'm going to push forward and hope that you'll give me the benefit of the doubt. As discussed, trauma is not static. It doesn't remain confined to the moments or circumstances that caused it. Trauma lingers and mutates and retransmits. It grows roots in our identity, our worldview, our relationships. It shapes how we move through life, how we see ourselves and others, how we interpret the systems and structures around us. If left unaddressed, trauma not only impacts individuals, but ripples outward, shaping families, communities, and even the ways we fight for change in the world. Across society today, we are witnessing an unprecedented rise in activism and cultural conflict across the political spectrum. Groups rally around causes with urgency and passion, identifying singular issues as the root of their fear, pain, and insecurity. Mute yourself. These causes vary widely, political, social, cultural, but what they share is a common belief. If we can just fix this one thing, if we can just eradicate this one threat, if we can just put this one enemy in its place, the world will feel safe again. This is not to say these causes are unimportant, far from it. Many address legitimate injustice and systemic failures, which I myself have used my platform to highlight. But often the fervour and emotional intensity behind these movements reflect something deeper. They are not just about the issues themselves. They are often about the unresolved trauma of individuals and communities. When we feel unsafe or unseen, we often seek an external explanation for our pain. We look for a tangible enemy to blame, a specific problem to solve, believing that resolution will bring peace. And in this mad rush to render the world more acceptable to our wounded nervous systems, we attempt to dominate and control it. But often this belief rests on a fallacy. Trauma doesn't simply disappear once an external issue is resolved. Without healing, the underlying feelings of fear, insecurity, and mistrust will remain, and they will find a new target. Like broken people who move from one failed relationship to another, the fundamental problems resurface over and over again. Today, it might be inequality. Tomorrow, immigration. Next week, cancel culture. The week after that, free speech, absolutism. The endless shifting of focus reflects an uncomfortable truth. Until the deeper work of healing begins, external solutions will not necessarily bring peace. Similarly, when movements or groups hinge their identity entirely on a single external solution, they risk becoming stuck in an incomplete narrative. The story becomes one of victimization, of grievance, of endless opposition to the other. While there is often truth in these stories, trauma is real, injustice is real, reforms are necessary. They remain incomplete if they do not also include the possibility of agency, healing, and transformation. Open-mindedness to the possibility we may not possess all the answers, space held for nuance and complexity. When our nervous systems are activated, however, these essential components of well-being are cast aside without thought. Worse still, the abandonment of these principles is viewed as an essential requirement of fighting the culture war. As we explored in the previous chapter, there's a subtle difference between victim status and a victim mentality. Activism underscored by a victim mentality, whether personal or cultural, can be comforting and constricting in equal measure. It allows us to name our pain and find solidarity with others, but it can also keep us from recognising those narratives which are incomplete and those behaviours which are toxic. Despite many areas of disagreement between warring factions across culture, we see clear similarities in how various groups behave when they are driven by unprocessed trauma. There is usually a privileging of in-group experiences over those of an out-group. In-group trauma is real and cannot be questioned or denied, while out-group trauma is seen as confected or a cynical weaponisation for political gain. We see deep commitment to the notion that the out-group doesn't simply hold beliefs which are disagreeable or that come with material implications. Out-groups are said to threaten the very existence of the in-group, merely by believing what they believe. And we see out-groups' beliefs framed as an existential threat to individuals, groups, cultures, or even civilization, and a complete abandonment of perspective in the face of arguably more tangible existential threats, nuclear annihilation, climate change. If we took every campaigning group's claims at face value, then almost every live culture war issue currently being contested in the digital public square represents a zero-sum game, a winner-takes-all scenario where there is no incentive to compromise, where attempts at mediation are recast as complicity, and where anything but complete capitulation from adversaries will suffice. This is not political debate. It's large cohorts of activists, campaigners, advocates, and their followers operating from deep, deep woundedness. I'm going to skip through this wee bit. Trauma wreaks havoc on our threat sensitivity and risk perception, amplified by algorithms calibrated to keep us trapped in a state of vigilance. And these conditions determining the nature of reality becomes an immense task, even for the calmest, most rational people. From such unstable ground, how exactly can any movement to meaningfully change the world be mounted? This is not a dismissal of activism or advocacy, nor an attempt to minimise your particular assessment of your particular problem, born of a desire to police your tone or your approach. This is simply a call to embark on these efforts with greater self-awareness. What are we fighting for, we must ask? Are we fighting for change because we've healed, or because we haven't? Are we motivated by hope or unresolved pain? Do we wish to lift our fellows up, or tear down our abusers? The answers matter. They really, really do. If you move into position in the battlefield without first having considered these questions, you quickly become disorientated. How do we feel physically when we engage in our activism? Do we experience a sense that we're grounded, protected even, the body's way of reassuring us that we are safe and on the right track? Or do we conduct our business while drowning in emotional floods, heart rate elevated, laboured breathing, feeling like the walls of our lives are closing in? Do we disagree with our opponents while remaining aware they are people like us, with as rich and layered an internal justification for their views as us? Or does dehumanising them make our job that bit easier? Whatever world is eventually forged from your place of woundedness will not be a happy one, and whatever successes derive from the battle, they will not last. Trauma-driven activism, while powerful in the short term, satisfying in the white-hot light of conflict, eventually burns us out. It fractures movements, alienates allies, leaves its participants emotionally exhausted, whatever the cause, wherever the fight. Healing-driven activism, by contrast, is rooted in resilience, connection, and a clear-eyed understanding of both personal and collective power. It acknowledges the role of systems and structures while also holding space for the perspectives of the other. It recognises that true change occurs not simply when beliefs are being asserted with conviction, but when that parallel work on ourselves in the context of safe and nurturing relationships is also being done. When I engage with people in recovery, my priority is to offer hope and support for sobriety unconditionally, not to politicise their pain or co-opt their lived experiences. Had I been screened for my political beliefs when I stumbled through the doors in 2013, I suspect I've been thrown back out onto the street. Countless men I've supported in the early days of their recovery were riddled with grievances and resentments entirely antithetical to my personal politics. I welcomed them into my home nonetheless, and we did the work. That's the work that keeps me well. That's the work that makes me an effective campaigner. It's when I stop doing that work that I come undone under the weight of my own nonsense. Healing in this context arises from mutual aid, respect, and relationships based on trust, not political goals. In those rooms, we leave our politics at the door. It's precisely because we keep politics and ideology out of those spaces. Hang on, sorry. It's precisely because we keep politics and ideologies out of those sacred spaces that recovery is even possible. We recognise that our beliefs, identities, and the stories we've been telling ourselves about who we are and why are often mirages produced by our alcoholic egos, themselves fabrications of untreated trauma. While systemic reform remains essential, and throughout our lives we will be called upon to enter the sphere of politics to fight for justice, whatever that looks like for us, The idealism underpinning much of trauma advocacy often clashes with the reality of the condition, running contrary to the principles of healing. I see therapists and activists online coaching clients on how to ascertain the political beliefs of their therapists, ensuring they don't encounter anyone who might see the world differently, as it may be re-traumatising. I see lived experiences politicised before individuals sharing their lives are even aware of their own views on political issues. And I see campaigning organisations which on one hand seek to educate us about basic principles like coercion and consent, thrusting people with trauma into the public square to disclose their pain before they're in a fit state to cope with the fallout for public relations and political purposes. As discussed, healing from trauma involves developing a willingness to toss aside certain incomplete narratives which no longer serve us. In the realm of campaigning, we are often asked to embrace clear falsehoods in service of the ambitions of facilitators, be they radical or pragmatic. It may be far more useful to regard any political activity in which we may engage as supplementary to our recovery from trauma rather than a prerequisite of it. The truth is, healing does not require a person to enter the political sphere whatsoever. While I agree that trauma has systemic roots and requires political action to address, I question the popular notion that survivors themselves should feel obligated to participate in political action, or whether such ambition is even realistic most of the time. I've been in that sphere for many years, and I can assure you it's not the place to go looking if truly healed people are what you're after. Healed people do not play games with human lives. They don't withdraw compassion or support on the basis of another's belief or background. And they don't make political capital out of the trauma and grief of the most vulnerable, or play one group's pain off against another's for reasons of strategy. That is what toxic people do. Too many decision makers have simply professionalised behaviour that would be deemed unacceptable or abusive in most households. Far from lacking understanding or consciousness, the further into recovery we get, the less time we may want to spend around people like that. Many healed people understand the politics of trauma perfectly well, yet remain resolved to stay out of it, like alcoholics stay out of pubs. The way through, as I see it, is for people living with the scars of trauma to recognise that change can come in many forms and need not be led by the politically minded radical or pragmatist, nor the opportunistic politician. It needn't be political at all. While healing cannot occur outside the context of relationships, a nurturing relational network can be entirely free of political motive. Don't let anyone tell you any different. For some, their energy may be better spent running as far from political campaigning as possible, and strength to anyone who chooses to do so. Despite our hopes for a better, more compassionate world, the reality is sobering. That's why those of us living with trauma who wish to see a fairer world need to wise up. The evidence suggests that the society we wish to see is far from materialising, and operating from woundedness may be our small part in an agonising stalemate. Every minute we spend unconsciously acting from our wounds, we play into the hands of others who would co-opt or reframe our anger for their own purposes. In many ways, our society mirrors the dynamics of a dysfunctional family, and we too often play the roles assigned to us. In such families, toxic members dominate, dictating how everyone else must behave. They justify their abuse and neglect through deception and coercion, ensuring that any challenge to their authority is met with punishment or shame. Over time, the rest of the family internalises the blame, believing that their suffering is their own fault, or goes angrily in search of a scapegoat. We carry this burden questioning ourselves instead of recognising the broader dysfunction at play and the part we unwittingly play as it unfolds. This realisation can be unsettling and even painful, but it's also a moment of awakening. To see the dynamic for what it truly is, a society structured much like that toxic family we know so well. We begin in disentangling ourselves from the incomplete narratives and assigned identities that constrain our growth and usefulness. This is not a call to despair, but to clarity. We cannot hope to fix what we do not foresee clearly. But this awakening must also encompass an understanding that irrespective of how unjust our world may be, the bulk of the work of healing, the wounds it inflicts, remains ours. This shouldn't be taken as a green light to descend the individualist rabbit hole, endlessly lapping the trauma industrial complex in a tedious loop of full awareness building. In the end, trauma is both a personal and collective endeavour, and we can't do it alone. Recovery requires a delicate balance of agency and community, of self-reliance and support. It requires that we hold two truths at once. We are shaped by our circumstances, but not entirely defined by them. That we are victims of systems, but also the authors of our own lives. A more radical communitarian approach must be adopted in light of the cold, hard truth that for some, help beyond their most basic needs simply is not coming. We live in a time of immense turmoil, uncertainty and danger that requires more of us than merely surfing the self-help aisles, crafting designer identities, or making up the numbers on someone else's political team sheet. We must rise up as individuals and take responsibility for our healing, and then, if we desire, leverage our newfound power to bring about change, not in a wider abstract world that barely registers our existence, but on our own doorsteps. Bell Hooks argues that love is a profoundly political act. Many assume that means affirmation of our experiences and validation of our pain. Maybe it does. But what if love is about more than just putting your arm around someone and listening to their story? What if love in a deeper sense is also about putting your arm around that person, looking them in the eye and telling them some home truths they might not want to hear? Truths upon which their life may someday depend. As I see it, one truth some of us may have to accept, despite our idealistic reservations, is that we may not be able to change the world, that the world may be beyond the scope of some of our expertise, or rather, the change we're sold is unlikely to arrive in the grand transformative manner many theorists, academics, and activists envision. I can feel my assigned identity flashing back from within as I put into words what would have been previously unthinkable to me. I am not making a case here that change isn't possible, or that a better quality of life lies permanently beyond reach, nor do I encourage using the immensity of the situation as an excuse to become apathetic or nihilistic. I simply mean that we must whittle our hopes down to a more manageable size, relieving ourselves of grandiose designs, paying closer attention to the order of business. Some would sooner die trying to overthrow the government than just go to fucking therapy. The inner work cannot be postponed until after the revolution. The revolution begins within. Those who dismiss this as a neoliberal cliche are welcome to their beliefs, beliefs which are often as predictable as their assigned identities and incomplete narratives will allow. Into the bargain, these particular unfortunates who do my nutting, who take permanent refuge from reality in their theories, frameworks and counterfactual fantasies, are among the most privately miserable people roaming the earth. What they know about healing, you could write in the back of a stamp, leaving room for all 2,500 pages of Das Kapital, including volumes 2 and 3 they've yet to read. Their simmering toil, that agitated emotional signature, arises not from a deep concern for others, but from the pain of waking up every day to find the same misbehaving world, refusing to fit itself to their ideological straitjackets. Take no direction on life from anyone who offers the same answer to every question. If your first act of healing is to run as far as your knees will allow, from this sort of character, you will have made a good beginning. Well, certainly not as glamorous a notion as reordering the world around us in some idealised, self-aggrandising revolution. It's in our own broken communities that our lived experiences are often most urgently needed. And it's on this front that many of us may come to find our true calling and perform our true service to the world, whether that world changes or not. Did getting sober solve every problem in my life? No. Did it offset socioeconomic inequality? No, of course not. But by prioritising the most urgent problem, addiction arising from untreated trauma, and becoming resolved to confront it, I was after a time better placed to bring myself more fully to the many other challenges beyond my immediate control. And as my personal load lightened, my attention gradually turned to how I might help others. In all my years of campaigning on class inequality, trauma and addiction, very little has changed in the world of politics. It's in the rooms of recovery where no facilitators are present, where no politician dare venture, where lived experience stories are shared freely in a safe, discreet, and genuinely loving environment, that I bear witness to true radical transformation one day at a time. And all I do in those rooms is put out some chairs, boil a couple of kettles, and humbly hold space for others like it was once held for me. For some of us, that's what changing the world really looks like. Thank you.
So we've got time for one or two quick questions. Has anyone got any questions, either in the room, just want to put your hand up, or online?
The Marxists away.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if you could reflect on your own position when you were writing the chapters, the lines. How, did you move from the radical to the pragmatist to the hopeful to the hopeless altogether? I'm just wondering where your positioning was as the president.
Yeah, certainly. Have we got another microphone?
Not totally confident. Let's go.
Okay, no worries. I can hear the questions. Oh, it's for the people on Zoom, right? Okay. Well, for me, my politics are informed by my lived experience of recovery. So there's an extra dimension in my politics, which is sometimes quite unusual in political spaces, where I understand, core of my being, that there is an individual, there is agency, and that self-will can be brought to bear over certain circumstances, irrespective of how unjust they are. And I make that argument time and time again, not because it's fair, but because it's deeply practical in a context where it's very clear social systems are in decline. And if someone is sitting with a broken leg by the roadside and they think help is coming, that's going to dictate how much time they're going to take before they start moving. If you tell them help's not coming, then their thinking recalibrates based on the reality. I think it's better to tell people the truth. The truth is, your basic needs will continue to be met. But this idea that somehow mental health services are going to be well equipped one day soon, and you're going to be able to walk in and get EMDR therapy or CBT for your trauma, it's a nonsense. That doesn't mean we can't begin the work of healing. So really, I don't take a radical or a pragmatic position, maybe pragmatism based on my own experience. But ultimately, I always try to speak directly to the people who are looking at the pragmatists and looking at the radicals, because I think that that's really where my audience is. Thank you.
I've got great. So unfortunately, I think we need to get out of the room. So I'll let one person have one last very quick question. So just great.
Hello, I'm speaking from my experience of somebody who's trying to support somebody who has multiple addictions. And I'm just wondering, and this probably isn't a very quick question,
That's okay, take your time.
You were at a point when somebody said something to you, and you were about to open that bottle. I've been with this person who's been at a point who said, I won't do this again, I'm ready, and 20 odd years and we're still not ready. And I don't know what happened at that point that you said, actually, I need to do something today, and I'm pouring that bottle down the sink. Sorry, does that make sense?
No, it does, yeah. I think that's a good question to end on. Yeah, I mean, that's the question that baffles people supporting addicts as well as addicts ourselves. One of the things I talk about in the book is that in the lived experience culture and climate, there is this affirm-only pro-validation stance on everybody's lived experience and everybody's interpretation of the lived experience, but sometimes our interpretations of what happened are not accurate and objectively false, or they've been filled in through a process of false memory and narrative construction, which is a process mentally that we all engage in to make sense and meaning of our lives. In the rooms of recovery, that's not what we do. In the rooms of recovery, we say, we love you, but you're full of shit. Right? We say, look, we tell ourselves little stories to comfort ourselves, to cover for all of the things in the shadow self that we don't want to own up to, that we don't want to show in a public persona. And sometimes it's when that truth bomb is deployed, according to the intuition of someone who has also had it deployed on them, that we see a psychic shift, a window of lucidity opens, and a person suddenly becomes aware of the gravity of the situation that addiction has brought them to. Unfortunately, loved ones can't perform this role because loved ones have so much skin in the game, and they've unwittingly been co-opted and recruited into a toxic structure which enables the addict. So the only way that you can really have any influence over the addict is to put boundaries in. And boundary isn't, please stop stealing money off my purse. A boundary is, if you steal money off me again, I'm phoning the police. Right? A boundary is what you're going to do. It's not what you want them to do. And those are the hardest things to practice with people we love, whether they're addicts or not, as many as you will know. But I wish you luck and thanks for your question.